We see the signs of supply chain dysfunction at every turn. At the home renovation store, at the car dealership, at the grocery store. We see it in the rising inflation rates. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have demonstrated just how fragile our supply chains are, and how important they are to the world economy and to all of our lives. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. My name is Doug Heintzman. I am the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we're going to be looking at how Web3 and blockchain will change the supply chain and logistics business. And to help us explore this topic, I am delighted to welcome Rob Chester to the podcast. Rob is the Chief Executive Officer of Ubloquity. Ubloquity is developing blockchain-based solutions for the food supply chain space. I should also note that Ubloquity was a finalist for this year's Web3 and Blockchain Transformation Awards. Welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, I was looking at your bio on LinkedIn, and it's interesting the kind of career path that you've had. For much of your career, you've been a compliance person, right? You were at Walmart and you did a bunch of other compliance positions at a number of companies, and now you're running a blockchain company. So, what was it and when was it that you kind of had your epiphany and decided to pivot into this space?
Gosh, what a really good question. I've had several epiphanies through my career. I say the first time I really came across blockchain was when I was asked to go to China as Walmart's chief compliance officer. And I was asked to go into a very difficult situation. They got themselves into real difficulty with the food provenance issue of people claiming pork was organic. You may remember, Doug, because it was all over the American newspapers, and that's never good for Walmart because, they really do care about their brand, and it was a pretty difficult, horrible situation to go into. But basically the summary was that the traditional compliance tools hadn't done a very good job of highlighting the problem. And so it's over a decade ago that I first came across blockchain as a potential solution for supply chain fraud that was happening at that moment in time. But I guess more recently from that, the other epiphany I've had in my last job, I was running a certification body in the UK for a global company, NSF, very good organisation, very good company. But still, for a certification body, they were still very much in the traditional space as to what they wanted to offer and what they wanted to do. And the reason why I think blockchain is a potential game changer for the compliance world and supply chains in general is just the concept of proper risk management, is that a lot of certification bodies still are there to complete and manage audits in essence. And audits in my world are a very slow way to get very old news. And therefore, I could see the potential for blockchain technology of the way it could transform key aspects of the compliance field, but much more broadly than that, much more exciting than that, the potential for blockchain technology to start transforming supply chains in general. And that's really important in the compliance world, because the thing about the compliance world is it's relatively small, relatively confined, and therefore trying to prove a return on investment for IT solutions like blockchains is quite hard to do, and much, much easier if you can point to other benefits as well as compliance improvements.
Okay, great. So it's interesting. How this whole space has evolved. I mean, in many ways, the supply chain logistics space has been a bit of a laggard in digitization. And I think that's probably because of just how many different parties are involved in the process. And so you've got a multi-party coordination, multi-party stakeholder problem. But I also think that the pandemic and now some of the energy shocks going on, especially in Europe, are really showing us just, how much trouble our supply chains are in, and have exposed all kinds of weaknesses. How bad do you think the problem really is? And,
It's really interesting because I think what COVID did was expose some lies about how people like me have been taught about supply chains. Because there's the lean concept has been around forever, with the Toyota and manufacture and production. And there were a couple of aspects about that COVID really exposed as being a massive problem. And one was basically lean says it doesn't really matter where in the world your suppliers are. And suddenly, when something like COVID comes along, which massively disrupts physical movement of goods around the world, suddenly exposes something that everybody has sort of thought of true for ages. It doesn't matter where in the world my suppliers are. And secondly, another aspect of it exposed was clearly this concept of just in time, which the whole world moved from just-in-time deliveries to just-in-case stock holding. It was a massive sea change for an industry, which for many, many years, I was taught as a retail manager, your stock holding was dead. You really didn't want to have, it was dead money because basically you were having to hold stock and you really didn't need to do that. It was all just-in-time deliveries. And then again, COVID comes along and really exposes that huge fallacy that you really don't want to do that. It was fine for the old world, but for the world in which we're now operating, suddenly that buffer stock became really, really important. So yes, I'm with you. I think COVID is going to be seen as one of those moments where firstly, things that people previously thought to be true were suddenly exposed as maybe not true. But secondly, a catalyst for change. I think because suddenly that people really had this exposure really highlighted to them. And if you just take one example of that, supply chain transparency, this aspect of just knowing where your goods are. I remember being sat in a retailer 15, 20 years ago, and if you were ordering goods from the Far East, it's on the water was probably about as good as you were going to do until those goods arrived in the port of destination, and then the retailer could get them into their supply chain. And fundamentally, that's just not good enough anymore. The world we're all living in is people can just turn to their phone, can't they, now, and see where their deliveries from couriers are on that journey. It's completely transparent to the consumer. And a lot of the world that I left, things like food safety, it is not transparent to the consumer. Good controls in place, lots of things that are there, but fundamentally not transparent to the people who need it. And so I see blockchain being the way and the method that an awful lot of that change can be a catalyst for how that change is going to happen a lot faster than it would do otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Whenever systems and parts of the economy have undergone considerable stress that has exposed some of their, weaker elements and as you say, exposed some of the fallacies and the assumptions that we've had, these experiences often kind of, shed the frivolous and unproductive, and also create an environment where there's an awful lot of innovation. And I have a gut feeling that we're going to see about 5 to 8 years of innovation squeezed in the next 18 to 24 months. Right? We're going to see massive acceleration in space just because it's so apparent, how broken a lot of these systems are and, how false some of the assumptions we had about the commodity nature of inputs.
I think that's right. And I think one of the reasons why in Ubloquity we've actually had a pretty good, although we're a startup and we're only just over a year old, we've made really fast improvements. But one of the reasons why we've identified something you just said, which is for a blockchain usually to get momentum, we look for 5 factors, and one of them is a catalyst event. And that can be a big event like Brexit or COVID coming along. But normally for change to happen, particularly in conservative industries like compliance, where you to get into compliance, you usually are quite risk averse. You're not usually a massive risk taker and, put you in charge of compliance. That usually doesn't happen. So you've got quite a conservative industry. And so you do actually need a catalyst event that actually says something's now changed. the sufficiency need for that area has now changed. And I think you're right. I think we're living through one of those periods.
So you've got a catalyst event that provides the incentive to change. And you've got this new technology, this Web3 and blockchain technology, which has some very interesting attributes. And I've heard you use the term multifaceted benefits before. And I think that's quite an apt term here. Could you just expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges I never really realized about the compliance field until I left it is that it's subject based. And if you were to look at a traditional great retailer like Walmart, how do you build your compliance program? They generally do it in relation to subjects. So when I was a compliance officer, I was accountable for 14 different areas of compliance, everything from antitrust to health and safety to food safety. And the challenge with building that is often you then start to build IT solutions in that same format and in that same way. And the problem with that is then that your return on investment business cases start to look very difficult to prove because you really are just looking to fix a vertical problem that's quite siloed. And one of the benefits that I could see that blockchain technology could bring was ultimately it could work across many of those areas and deliver what I call multifaceted benefits. What do I mean by that? Well, basically what I mean is if you were to look at one of the solutions we've developed with a partner here, actually the number one reason that they've actually invested in the technology and developed the benefit is efficiency. It is actually a much more efficient way of running their business than they had before. But they've also got a physical security benefit. So actually it's harder to break into their trucks and harder to steal goods from them. They've actually got an environmental benefit because this actually allows real-time tracking of the goods and knowing where they are, so you can get things like carbon footprint and miles per gallon, etc., of trucks that are moving. You've also got a health and safety benefit for the driver who's running. So I guess my point is, many compliance teams, unfortunately, still think quite vertically about solutions and about responses that they're looking for. And I think for the future, what's going to happen is for solutions to get traction, particularly in the economic climate that the world's about to enter for the next few years, you really want to be able to point to multiple benefits. So if all you can point to is the fact that, yeah, my food traceability is going to get better, well, I think best of luck with that, because I think you're going to have a challenge. And one of the aspects that I can see that blockchain technology can build is that ability for a business to point to multiple different benefits from introducing the same solution. And that potentially is a real game changer because it really makes the CFO sit up and take notice if they can point to multiple benefits for introducing a solution.
So let's dig down into some of those benefits. You were just mentioning, this visibility, and kind of inherent what you were saying was this question of provenance. And you also talked about, in the food space. I remember, it was back in 2004, 2005, somewhere in that time frame. There was an E. coli contamination of spinach, and it killed a lot of people and put a lot of people in the hospital. And basically the government, the U.S. government, shut down all sales of spinach for, I think it was 2 weeks, while they sent, FDA inspectors out to try to figure out where in the world this contamination happened and, who else might be impacted by it. And it ended up costing the industry, just vast amounts of money. I mean, it was ridiculous. And of course, we didn't have salad, we didn't have spinach for a few weeks. And it also undermined public confidence, which I think was another, big challenge. And so, I know that Walmart, amongst others, have actually been working on, the Food Trust Project and other ways of trying to, get the various different people, especially in, green leaf produce and those sorts of things, to participate in a system so that we have that kind of visibility. So how does it was very, very exciting. I mean, the idea of being able to, to go to check out, from a store and understand, where it's been and who's had custody of it and whether it's actually organic or whether it has any allergens in it. There's all kinds of reasons that kind of visibility is very, very valuable. But what are the issues and the challenges around making that vision a reality?
Lots. I don't think there's going to be any doubt where it's going to end up. And I truly do think in between 10 and 20 years, people will be walking around a retailer with their phone. They'll be able to scan almost every product. They'll be able to therefore get the full history of that product and information, going all the way back to a farm, and full transparency and traceability. I believe that's where it's going to end up, because I believe that an awful lot of that information already exists and is already there, but it isn't in a consumer-facing and a consumer way that actually can be done. The challenge of doing it very much is around, if you took the retailer angle, they're very strong in their primary producers. So for me, as a compliance officer, if you ask me to say, your direct suppliers, Mr. Chester, have you got that under control? Most first world retailers now would absolutely be answering that question. Yes, we have. We know who supplies our goods. We've got a very, very good, clear picture of what we do and how we do it. But if you think of a farm, particularly a product like spinach, there will often be at least 2 or 3 intermediaries between that retailer and that farmer who's actually grown the product. And that is a massive challenge, because obviously what you've got is a contractual situation. You've got very good reasons why that person that's supplying in does not want to give full traceability to a retailer of all aspects of their supply chain that goes up. Sometimes because they haven't got it, often because they actually have got it, but they're terrified the retailer understands that supply chain and wants to cut out all the middlemen that will be having their aspect between it. But ultimately what I believe, and this is what we call federation, Doug, and what we believe at Ubloquity is increasingly federation of blockchains is going to happen at different stages of the supply chain. So Ubloquity's already got aspects on farm today where we are doing that traceability that you've just spoken about with a farmer on a farm. And we've got case studies where that's the case. And what we believe is going to happen over time is increasingly blockchain technology is going to be used through that supply chain. And we believe federation is going to increasingly happen, where one blockchain will be seamlessly able to interoperably talk to other blockchains that are operating in that supply chain. And that will drive the transparency. Now, it will take time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But I think the end destination is very clear, isn't it? Just like anybody would look at an order on an Amazon order on your phone today and be able to real-time track where your product is, where it's come from, who the supplier is, that's where it's definitely going to end up. But there are some genuine reasons as to why that's a problem. But I put it to you, probably most of them aren't technical reasons, aren't technology reasons. They're going to be behavioral reasons and other reasons why people necessarily won't want to give that transparency. But it is coming. And certainly in the food safety and compliance world, you see, what should give us all hope is often the information is there. It isn't there to be publicly viewed, and it isn't there for public reassurance. But if you take most of the food safety, what's the reason why we kill so many fewer people today than we did in the 1960s or 70s, with food that gets produced around the world, is because food safety has dramatically improved over that time. It's just not been improved in a way that's been transparent to consumers. And that's definitely going to change over the next 10, 15 years. Because it is just what the next generation already expects. They already expect to be able to look on their phone and see almost every aspect of their life. And I don't believe supply chains are going to be any different.
I think that's fascinating. And, you mentioned a really interesting kind of concept in the middle of that, which is the multi-party contracting problem, right? So, right now, supply chains, to some extent, exhibit some of the same sort of challenges you have when you're driving on a busy highway, right? That the information you have is the lights in the car in front of you, and when the brake lights go on, you have to slow down quickly, and then you communicate that information to the people behind you. And the point of contact is always, the near adjacent, participants in the same system. And the transparency that you were just talking about, first of all, potentially gives us this visibility that allows you to see beyond the car in front of you to 20 cars to a kilometer to 5 kilometers ahead to understand, what's going on so that you can plan appropriately for it. And that's great. But it also suggests that you need to find some mechanism to allow, well, in this scenario, all these cars to decide what their respective actions are so that your action can be part of that collective decision making. And in a similar sort of way, the supply chain challenge has been encumbered by the contracting mechanisms that we have that are basically party to party. Whereas in a world where we can benefit from the transparency of the underlying data, and we have, the smart contracting capability, in theory, we should be able to have multiple parties that have co-interests in the system, figure out how to contract with each other, how to move value and payments around the system in automated ways based on various different conditional elements. How much benefit do you see coming out of that part of the blockchain solution?
It's game changing, isn't it, when you describe it like that? Because it is fundamentally such a different world to the world that I described before, that's traditionally how supply chains have operated. And so for many people, Doug, that's going to be really quite scary, because back to, if you believe this end-to-end visibility is going to happen and is going to come, it's very obvious that something like smart contracts are going to be a way that transformation is actually going to happen. But this almost goes to the reason why we created Ubloquity in the first place, because you see, I think the challenge to it is going to be the traditional players and traditional mindset. Because as one of my investors put it to me quite recently, basically turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And the traditional players that are operating in these supply chains, some of them will be brave and will say, this is inevitable. This is where it's going to end up. Therefore, we should absolutely embrace the technology, and we should find a way that we can interact really well with people who are up the chain from us and down the chain from us. But at the same time, human nature tells us that an awful lot of other people are going to resist it like there's no tomorrow. And so where we've found the most progress is with those companies that basically have seen that that's where the future's headed. And that's what needs to be done. And it is a paradigm shift. But I think we saw this through COVID, didn't we? I believe there were 3 types of businesses through COVID. There was the type of business who previously running before COVID and just really want to get back to their previous business model. That's what they're yearning for. They're just yearning for yesterday to return. You've got the businesses in the second group who begrudgingly changed their business model. So they've reflected the fact that actually we do need to change a bit. Let's do a bit. And then you've got the third group of businesses that saw this is potentially a game changer. We need a blank sheet of paper here. We need to really rethink how our business model operates and what we do. And my betting is that most of the people in that third group are going to be new businesses or new startups who have decided that world is never returning, and that a small change is not going to be needed. Actually, it is a paradigm shift. And one of my conclusions at beginning and starting Ubloquity was that actually it needs some new kids on the block to enable that change to happen and enable it to come through an awful lot quicker than it would do otherwise. So I think your vision is right. I think the smart contracts aspect, really starting to disrupt that supply chain going backwards, is the right way and the right approach. But I think the challenge is going to be whether businesses are going to pivot and change to that future, be dragged there kicking and screaming because other businesses come along that are going to potentially replace their business model if they don't change.
Well, one of the stakeholders in that whole system is the government, regulators, border crossings, customs control, which and all of those things are important elements of the supply chain and add a fair amount of friction to the supply chain if applied in certain kinds of ways. Which group do you think the regulators find themselves in, and how do they fit into this whole puzzle?
It's a brilliant question. I was actually asked to go up to Oxford University a couple of years ago and speak to there is a group of regulators, a global group of regulators that do meet. An excellent Oxford professor, guy called Chris Hodges, who leads that, who's trying to do this regulation of the future and has written a couple of really excellent books about where he sees regulation going and how it's going to evolve. Because the point of your question is spot on. The only thing that will likely evolve even slower than businesses are regulators. And that's because the world that I left, again, is laws are written down. And if you look at the whole evolution of the internet over the last 20 years, you just see how woefully ill-equipped most regulation is to cope with paradigm shifts and change like that. And actually, I believe it's an area where if the regulators do not start to think the unthinkable about how they're going to develop and move faster to be able to keep up with that pace of change, there's going to be major problems. I do some mentoring for a group, and I had to do mentoring for some young lads in Birmingham. And I had to write this thesis, and I've not written anything that's sort of that length before, but I ended up writing something about the impact of social media on the kids. And one of the things that struck me as I was writing this was that what we're actually conducting at the moment is a mass untested social experiment. You know, you never put a food product on the market without going through a rigorous due diligence process to make sure that the food is going to be safe before it ends up on a retailer's shelf. You'd never do that. But what we've actually done with this whole social media space over the last 20 years basically is allow all of this to happen. And now we're just starting to study and understand and figure out what impact it's actually having on everybody and how it's going to work. And I think that's just a really good example for you of where regulators have just really struggled to keep up with the pace of change that's operating and happening. Well, there's a few glints of light, though. There's actually in the UK, there is actually a blockchain parliamentary group in the UK, with a group of MPs, a group of members of parliament that are really interested in blockchain. So there are some real bright spots of regulators that are understanding that the traditional ways that legislation happened just are not fit for the world we're in today. But those bright spots are few and far between, and my word, do they need some encouragement. Yeah, as my father used to say, you know, new ideas need friends because old ideas have already got plenty.
Well, but you'd think that some of the benefits would be pretty obvious. I mean, you know, first of all, just the amount of friction that supply chains impose on an economy, on a society, are, you know, significant and incredibly obvious. And in the particular case of Great Britain, the UK, it's you know, the Irish backstop problem is a really thorny issue, and at least in theory. You know, a blockchain-based supply chain logistics system should allow us to basically have a digital twin version that would allow the trade of goods and services to be regulated with the intent of the regulation intact, but without necessarily incurring the frictions involved in actually moving the stuff around in the real world. Now, I know that there have been kind of some talk about that, you know, in the UK for a while. It's a thorny problem, largely because, you know, of adoption, but also, you know, you need some regulators, some government leadership to drive that, to incentivize that. And I would think that the payoff of solving that problem, considering the many alternatives that we've been struggling with, would be worthwhile, you know, looking at and investing in. Am I crazy, or is?
Oh, no, we're doing it.
You're doing it?
We are literally doing it. Yeah, absolutely. Our blockchain is being deployed right now as a solution to that challenge on the Northern Ireland border. So that's one of our use cases. So I don't know whether you knew that already or you just slipped that in, but absolutely I could see the potential for technology to be a solution to this. So all the way back in 2018, after Brexit first happened. We've hosted more interested parties and politicians and logistics firms on this than you would believe. So yes, we actually have got a solution that is operating right now, where blockchain technology is being deployed right now for that real solution. Because if you just think of the whole aspect of trade, Doug, still the vast majority of borders around the world are operating on a paper-based system. How crazy is that in 2022 that people are getting reassurance out of the fact that someone was able to fill in a piece of paper, as opposed to these goods really are what they say they are, and transparency and traceability around all of that. So yeah, it brings you on nicely to Ubloquity's strategy is in three areas, which is provenance, trade, and borders. And that's because basically we can see the synergies and the crossover between all of those areas. The provenance aspect of knowing where stuff comes from obviously crossovers nicely with borders, because really at a border, that's a decision point where you should really understand it. And it crosses over well with trade, because if there's one thing that's going to help the world keep this economic challenge we're in at the moment as short as possible, it is going to be facilitating more trade. It's going to be facilitating more trade between different markets and different countries in a sustainable way, hopefully, as well.
Well, that's actually a good lead into kind of the last major question I had for you. Because part of accelerating trade and making it more resilient and adaptive is the trade finance and insurance components, right? It's the fact that all of these goods, at rest and in motion, represent a vast amount of assets that, because of the nature of supply chains and because of the nature of transportation, can't be fully collateralized and can never be properly insured. And because we don't necessarily have visibility into both the status and the quality, right? I mean, especially in cold chain, if there's a temperature excursion that, would destroy the viability of, pick something, a vaccine or something like that, being able to understand that that's true when it happens is a huge, it's hugely different than understanding it once you've put it in people's arms and realize that it's ineffective. And so it seems to me that, blockchain, one of its very powerful attributes is the ability to know where stuff is and what conditions it's in. And if you know that, am I wrong to believe that we can't finance it and collateralize it with much, much greater efficiency, that we can insure it with much greater precision? Is that one of these other multifaceted benefits, or how do you see that?
It absolutely is. And I think if you see the number of financial institutions that have now invested in blockchain technology, I think they're probably leading the way. I mean, you're more expert in that than me, Doug, but I think if you look to the prevalence of blockchain now within the finance world, it seems to have gone the fastest. And I think they've done it for one of those vertical reasons that I spoke about before, that they could see the opportunity for finance in that space and in that area. But for me, it's just another potential multifaceted benefit of where this could lead and how it could work. But yes, I mean, and for many years, and for my sins, I used to work on Walmart for insurance. And this whole concept of being able to see real time, really what a container contains, to be able to do insurance real time on real values, not averages, not estimates, but real time visibility and transparency, is again another absolute game changer for the insurance industry. I think the only question is going to be, similarly for the banks and similarly for insurance companies, is going to be, are the traditional guys going to pivot and going to change and going to adopt technology, or are they going to potentially be replaced by new movers that come along that can suddenly pitch their insurance quotes so much more competitively because they've got real information about real shipments and real goods? So yes, I think you're absolutely right that the finance and insurance elements will be part of this, and are likely to be the couple of the areas that move extremely quickly.
So it sounds like, despite the many challenges and problems that we're all facing, the stresses that many businesses and people around the world are currently enduring, it sounds to me like you're actually a bit of an optimist. that we may be on the cusp of a new era where the rules are changed and that our systems are just much more adaptive and resilient? Would that be? Is that going too far, or how do you?
No, it's not. It's not going too far. It's really. I was taught to see my career in 3 phases. So you start out and you're very dependent on others in the first stage of your career. The second stage of your career, you're building out what you want to do and how you want to do it. And I'm now just entering the third stage of my career, which is actually, this is a bit starting to be about legacy for me. I'm 50 years old next year. I know I don't look it, but I'm 50 years old next year. And for me now, it's about transitioning into this future state that leaves a bit of a legacy behind of where this is going to go. Because when I decided to leave my last role, I was very fortunate to get, traditional offers of come and be a compliance officer for us, etc. Very fortunate to get good offers. But I sort of thought that it's now or never, really. And if I believe this blockchain stuff, if I believe this is the future and how it's going to happen, then Rob, you've got to put your money where your mouth is and bet your career on doing it. So there were a few quizzical heads when an ex-compliance officer from Walmart turns up as a CEO of a startup in a blockchain business. But no, I'm doing it because I believe in that old Mandela quote of plan your future based on hope, not fear. I truly do believe it's one of these moments, Doug, where I think we'll look back in 10 years at this being one of those moments where the world really did start to change.
I totally get that. In fact, it's pretty much exactly that same reasoning that led me to the Blockchain Research Institute. So thank you, Rob, for helping us tackle this challenging topic. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find more research on this topic at the blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope you will join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.